Welcome to the Dark History Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Carter. In the shadows of post-war Europe, the institutions meant to house and protect the most vulnerable became the breeding ground for a chilling and inhumane narrative. These orphanages, echo chambers of lost childhoods, became the hidden conduits for a disturbing undercurrent of exploitation. The children, many of whom were orphaned by the war or abandoned by parents unable to provide for them, were seen as the perfect subjects for medical experimentation. Their lives were reduced to mere data points, their experiences to statistical probabilities. And all this happened under the veil of secrecy, under the guise of scientific progress and the greater good. As we delve deeper into this grim chapter of history, we unearth a network of complicit professionals and institutions. Doctors, scientists, and administrators, all trusted figures of authority, were key players in this elaborate scheme of systemic abuse. The victims? Innocent children, who were viewed not as individuals with rights, but as expendable resources in the quest for medical advancement. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Europe was in ruins. Cities were decimated, economies crippled, and societies fragmented. In the midst of this chaos, the scientific community was eager to push the boundaries of knowledge, driven by a desperate need for progress and healing. But in the absence of ethical boundaries, this pursuit of knowledge took a dark turn. Orphanages across the continent became the unsuspecting sites for these medical experiments. The children, young and vulnerable, were subjected to procedures ranging from drug trials to invasive surgeries. All this was done without their consent, without their understanding, and often without any real medical justification. The children were left scarred, physically and emotionally, their innocence stolen in the name of science. The true extent of this horror came to light only when a brave few decided to break the silence. Former orphans, now adults, began to share their experiences. Their stories were harrowing, filled with pain, betrayal, and a profound sense of injustice. It was their courage that sparked the first investigations into these clandestine operations. As the layers of this dark narrative began to unravel, the world was left grappling with a horrifying truth. The most trusted institutions had failed to protect the most vulnerable. A system that was supposed to protect and nurture had instead exploited and abused. The magnitude of this betrayal remains a stark reminder of the depths humanity can sink to when ethics and morality are cast aside. In the heart of the devastation of post-war Europe, the orphanages were filled to the brim, teeming with children left parentless by the ravages of war. Among the rubble and ruin, these institutions stood as grim testaments to the human cost of the conflict. Their very existence posed a question that was both logistical and moral: how to care for these countless children who had been thrust into a world that seemed ill-equipped and often unwilling to provide for them. For doctors and scientists operating in this era, the answer to this question became disturbingly utilitarian. The orphanages, filled with children who had been stripped of their families, their homes, and their rights, were seen not as a humanitarian crisis, but as an opportunity. These children, isolated and vulnerable, became the ideal subjects for a wide array of medical experiments. The breadth and depth of these experiments varied wildly, underpinned by a chilling lack of consistency or oversight. Some children were subjected to experimental drug trials, their small bodies used as test sites for new and unproven treatments. Others endured invasive surgeries, their physical integrity disregarded in the pursuit of medical knowledge. The orphanages became a sort of hidden laboratory, a place where the normal rules of morality and ethics seemed not to apply. The children, devoid of any agency or autonomy, were treated as little more than lab rats, their bodies and minds commodified in the name of progress. Their lives were irrevocably altered by these experiences, their childhoods marred by trauma and violation. Yet, in spite of the gravity of these abuses, the world remained largely ignorant of the plight of these children. The orphanages were cloaked in an unspoken veil of secrecy, their activities hidden from the public eye. The children themselves, isolated and voiceless, had no means to share their experiences, their stories buried beneath a culture of silence and complicity. It was within this culture of silence that the true horror of the situation was allowed to proliferate. Without scrutiny or accountability, the medical professionals involved were free to operate without restraint, their actions unchecked by any form of ethical or moral oversight. This absence of accountability allowed the abuses to continue unabated, leaving in their wake a generation of children scarred by their experiences, their faith in humanity irrevocably shattered. The architects of this horrifying chapter in medical history were not shadowy figures operating in the fringes of society. They were, in fact, esteemed members of the medical and scientific community, operating with the tacit endorsement of powerful institutions. These were doctors, researchers, and public health officials, lauded for their contributions to science and medicine, yet obfuscated by a shroud of respectability that allowed their unethical practices to go unquestioned. Dr. Loretta Bender, a prominent child psychiatrist, was one such figure. Operating out of Bellevue Hospital in New York City and later at Creedmoor State Hospital, Bender conducted extensive experiments on the orphan children under her care. She administered electroconvulsive therapy to hundreds of children, some as young as 3 years old, in a misguided effort to treat schizophrenia and autism. Another key figure was Dr. Saul Krugman, a respected pediatrician and researcher at Willowbrook State School in Staten Island. Krugman conducted experiments on the school's residents, most of whom were orphans or children from impoverished families. His infamous hepatitis studies, which involved deliberately infecting healthy children with the virus, were justified in the name of developing a vaccine. The power structures that allowed these atrocities to occur were complex, interwoven with the social, political, and economic fabric of the time. The post-war era was characterized by a pervasive faith in science and technology, a faith that often eclipsed empathy and ethical consideration. The children, most of whom were from marginalized communities, were seen as expendable in the grand scheme of scientific progress. These systems of power were further bolstered by a lack of legislative oversight. The Nuremberg Code, established in response to the atrocities committed during World War II, outlined ethical guidelines for human experimentation. However, these guidelines were largely ignored or loosely interpreted in the United States, particularly when it came to vulnerable populations such as orphans. Institutions like orphanages and state hospitals, often underfunded and overcrowded, became prime grounds for such exploitative practices. Many were complicit, willingly providing researchers with access to their young charges in exchange for financial support or the promise of prestige. In this environment, the children trapped within these institutions were rendered powerless, their bodies and lives subject to the whims of those who saw them not as humans in need of care, but as expendable commodities in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The damage inflicted by these experiments was profound and far-reaching, a dark legacy that continues to echo through the annals of medical history. Dr. Robert G. Heath, a psychiatrist and neurologist at Tulane University, was another major player in this grim chapter of American history. His experiments focused on the deep brain stimulation of patients, some as young as 5 years old, often using high doses of hallucinogenic drugs. Driven by a desire to uncover the neurological roots of schizophrenia, Heath's work was characterized by a shocking disregard for the physical and psychological well-being of his subjects. One of his most notorious studies involved a 19-year-old orphan named B-19. Heath implanted electrodes into the young man's brain, and subjected him to a pleasure and punishment regime, involving repeated doses of LSD and stimulation of the brain's pleasure centers. The purpose was to cure B-19's homosexuality, a goal as scientifically baseless as it was ethically abhorrent. Elsewhere, in the laboratories of the University of Minnesota, Dr. Wendell Johnson and his protégé, Mary Tudor, conducted the infamous monster study. This experiment saw 22 orphans divided into two groups, one of which was subjected to an onslaught of negative speech therapy, aimed at inducing and then studying stuttering. The effects of this psychological battering were severe and long-lasting, with many of the children suffering from speech problems and low self-esteem for the rest of their lives. These were not isolated incidents. Across the country, similar experiments were being conducted with little regard for the welfare of the children involved. The justification often given was the advancement of scientific knowledge, a noble goal that was twisted to serve deeply unethical ends. The medical establishment's complicity in these abuses was further compounded by the media's role in shaping public opinion. Stories of medical breakthroughs and pioneering treatments filled the headlines, creating an atmosphere of excitement and optimism around scientific progress. The dark underbelly of these advancements, the suffering and exploitation of the orphans, was conveniently ignored or buried. The scars left by these experiments were not only borne by the individuals involved, but also seeped into the fabric of the institutions that housed them. The culture of neglect and dehumanization that enabled such experiments to occur left a lasting mark, contributing to an ongoing cycle of abuse and mistreatment that continued long after the experiments themselves had ended. The atrocities committed in the name of medical advancement did not stop with the traumatization of these orphans. Delving further into the annals of history, we find even more harrowing tales. In the early 1960s, the Willowbrook State School in New York, an institution for children with intellectual disabilities, became the site of one of the most notorious medical experiments. Under the guise of a hepatitis study, Dr. Saul Krugman and his team deliberately infected over 700 children with the virus. The logic was chillingly pragmatic. The virus was rampant in the institution, so the children were likely to contract it anyway. This experiment was deemed a necessary evil to understand the stages of hepatitis and develop a vaccine. The children were fed extracts of stools from infected individuals, a procedure that was as degrading as it was dangerous. The experiments continued for years, with researchers callously observing the decline in the children's health. Despite the eventual development of a vaccine, the price paid by the children of Willowbrook was immeasurable. Many suffered from chronic hepatitis, liver damage, and a lifetime of health complications. Meanwhile, another chilling episode took place at the Fernald State School in Massachusetts. A study sponsored by the Quaker Oats Company, in association with the Atomic Energy Commission, sought to understand how the body absorbs nutrients from cereals. The method? Feeding radioactive isotopes to the school's orphans. The children, lured with the promise of joining a science club, were unwittingly subjected to this hazardous experiment. These grim accounts only scratch the surface of a far-reaching and systemic issue. From the 1930s through the 1970s, countless orphans, prisoners, and people from marginalized communities were subjected to dangerous and often fatal experiments, all in the name of a progress that privileged the few over the many. The fallout from these experiments was vast and profound. Not only did these studies leave behind a legacy of pain and suffering, but they also eroded trust in the medical establishment, causing lasting damage to the doctor-patient relationship. These injustices, largely hidden from public view, fueled a deep sense of betrayal among those who had been exploited, creating a chasm of mistrust that persists to this day. In the next segment, we will delve deeper into the aftermath of these atrocities, examining the long-term effects on the victims and the ripple effects that these experiments had on society at large. As the depth of these atrocities began to surface, the victims, their families, and society at large were left grappling with their aftermath. The survivors carried not only the physical scars, but also psychological wounds that were often deeper and more painful. For many of these children, their youth was stolen, their innocence lost, their trust in humanity shattered. The trauma of these experiences would follow them throughout their lives, influencing their relationships, their self-esteem, and their perception of the world. In the case of the Willowbrook State School, the children who were subjected to the hepatitis experiments were left with chronic health conditions. These ailments were a constant reminder of their past, a past they could never escape, stamped indelibly on their bodies and their minds. But the suffering was not confined to the victims alone. Their families, too, bore the burden of these inhumane practices. Parents and siblings struggled with feelings of guilt and helplessness, their grief compounded by the knowledge that their loved ones were used as mere pawns in the hands of those they were supposed to trust. Meanwhile, at the Fernald State School, the children who ingested radioactive isotopes were not only physically harmed, but also stigmatized. They were marked as different, their bodies and their lives forever altered by an experiment they neither understood nor consented to. The sense of betrayal was profound, the pain of being deceived by the adults they should have been able to trust, immeasurable. The ripple effects of these experiments extended beyond the victims and their families, reaching into society at large. The revelations of these unethical practices eroded trust in the medical community. People began to question the intentions and motives of doctors and scientists, the very individuals and institutions tasked with protecting and promoting health. This skepticism permeated other areas as well, casting a long shadow over research ethics and prompting the demand for stricter regulations and safeguards to protect vulnerable populations. Yet these grim narratives also sparked resistance. Outraged by the blatant disregard for human rights, advocates, lawyers, and activists took up the cause of these victims. Their fight was not only for justice, but also for systemic change, for the introduction of ethical guidelines that would prevent such abuses from happening again. Their efforts marked the beginning of a long and uphill battle against the silence and complicity that had allowed these atrocities to occur. The advocates who stepped forward to challenge the rampant exploitation were often met with formidable opposition. Their adversaries were not merely individuals, but powerful institutions that had been complicit in these unethical practices. These institutions, including hospitals, research centers, and government bodies, were deeply entrenched in the system, wielding considerable influence and resources. Despite the daunting odds, the advocates refused to be silenced. They relentlessly pursued justice, armed with the conviction that these orphans deserved more than mere acknowledgement of their suffering. They deserved reparation, accountability, and most importantly, the assurance that no other child would ever be subjected to such horrors. Among these advocates was a courageous lawyer named David Rothman. Rothman, armed with a formidable intellect and a deep sense of justice, took on the monumental task of exposing the unethical experiments. He worked tirelessly to gather evidence, meticulously documenting every case, every victim, and every violation. His groundbreaking work not only shed light on the horrific abuses, but also challenged the prevailing norms and assumptions within the medical and scientific community. Another key figure in this fight was Jean Edgar, a social worker who had witnessed firsthand the suffering of these children. Edgar's empathy and determination led her to spearhead a grassroots movement, rallying public support and bringing the issue to the forefront of societal consciousness. Her tireless advocacy put a human face to the victims, reminding society that these were not mere subjects of experiments, but children who had been robbed of their innocence and dignity. Together with other advocates, Rothman and Edgar engaged in a rigorous campaign, using legal, political, and social channels to press for change. They sought the prosecution of those responsible, the implementation of stringent ethical guidelines, and the establishment of systems to protect vulnerable populations. Despite the immense challenges, their efforts began to bear fruit. The public outcry became too powerful to ignore. The revelations prompted investigations, leading to the unearthing of previously concealed documents and testimonies. These investigations exposed the scale and gravity of the abuses, forcing the medical community and the government to confront their complicity. Yet, this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. The victims and their advocates would face a long, arduous journey towards achieving accountability and reform. Their struggle would serve as a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and ethical integrity in the pursuit of scientific knowledge and medical advancement. The fallout from the revelations was seismic. A wave of shock and revulsion swept across the nation, forcing a re-evaluation of medical ethics and legal parameters. The stories of the children sold into medical experiments were now in the public eye, and the outrage was palpable. The government, cornered by public opinion and the damning evidence, was compelled to act. A series of lawsuits and prosecutions were initiated. Some of the doctors and scientists involved in the experiments were indicted and convicted. A few of them faced jail time, but many managed to evade severe punishment due to legal loopholes and technicalities. The orphans who survived the experiments were left scarred, both physically and psychologically. But they were no longer invisible. Their stories had been heard, and their suffering acknowledged. Many of them received compensation from a government fund set up to address the injustices inflicted, although no amount of money could truly compensate for the horrors they had endured. In the aftermath, numerous ethical guidelines and regulations were instituted to prevent such atrocities from happening again. The Nuremberg Code, developed in the wake of World War II to address the Nazi human experiments, was revisited and reinforced. The code emphasizes voluntary informed consent, the minimization of harm and suffering, and the right of the subject to terminate the experiment at any time. The Institutional Review Board (IRB) system was also revamped. The IRBs, which are responsible for approving and reviewing research involving human subjects, were given more power and stricter guidelines. They were tasked with ensuring that future scientific endeavors would prioritize patient rights and safety above all else. One of the most significant outcomes of this sordid chapter was the acknowledgement of the need for greater oversight and accountability in medical research. The government introduced stricter laws and penalties for those who would dare to violate medical ethics. The medical community itself was forced to confront its own shortcomings and implement reforms. Despite the strides made, there was a lingering sense of unease. The ordeal had exposed a dark underbelly of scientific pursuit, a reminder of what could happen when ambition and curiosity overrode empathy and ethics. While justice had been served, albeit imperfectly, the memory of the orphans sold into medical experiments would serve as a haunting reminder of the importance of vigilance and ethical integrity in the pursuit of scientific and medical advancement. The legacy of the orphans sold into medical experiments is multifaceted, leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of medical research. The tragic events served as a catalyst for significant change, sparking a shift in the medical and scientific communities towards a more ethical and compassionate approach to research. The victims of these experiments were not forgotten. They became symbols of resilience and courage, their stories serving as a stark reminder of the need to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. Their experiences led to the creation of advocacy groups and nonprofits dedicated to safeguarding the rights of individuals used in medical research. In the broader society, the scandal prompted a re-evaluation of societal values and norms. The public was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that these atrocities had taken place under their watch, leading to a collective sense of guilt and responsibility. This led to a surge in public interest in medical ethics and a demand for more transparency and accountability in scientific research. The narrative also made its way into popular culture, being depicted in books, documentaries, and films, further increasing public awareness and keeping the conversation alive. The media played a crucial role in shaping public opinion and ensured that the issue remained at the forefront of societal discourse. On an institutional level, the impact of the orphans' experiences was profound. Schools and universities introduced mandatory courses on medical ethics, emphasizing the importance of informed consent and respect for human dignity. This curriculum shift aimed at instilling a strong ethical foundation in future generations of scientists and medical practitioners. The medical profession itself underwent a period of introspection and self-evaluation. Doctors and researchers were compelled to confront the darker aspects of their profession, leading to a reaffirmation of the Hippocratic Oath and a renewed commitment to do no harm. The legacy of the orphans, therefore, is not only one of suffering and exploitation, but also of change and progress. The painful chapter in history served as a wake-up call, a stark reminder of the potential for harm when scientific ambition is not tempered by human compassion. The story of the orphans sold into medical experiments is a potent testament to the enduring power of human resilience and the capacity for societal change in the face of injustice. It is a legacy that continues to shape the ethical landscape of medical research, informing discussions and decisions to this day. Yet, despite the changes that have occurred, there remain lingering questions. The government and the medical institutions' involvement in these experiments raises questions about the nature of power, responsibility, and the role of institutions in society. How could such atrocities have been sanctioned under the guise of progress? To what extent were these institutions aware of the extent of the injustices being perpetrated? The answers to these questions are not clear, and perhaps they never will be. The role of society itself is also called into question. How did the community allow these vulnerable children to become the subjects of such horrific experiments? The societal mechanisms that facilitated such breaches of trust and decency demand further exploration. The societal apathy that allowed these events to occur is a chilling reminder of the potential for mass complicity in acts of cruelty. Moreover, one must question the very nature of the medical profession. While the Hippocratic Oath commands physicians to do no harm, the cases of these orphans underline the potential for harm when medical professionals misuse their power. It underscores the need for constant vigilance and ethical checks on the practice of medicine. The story of the orphans sold into medical experiments also raises the question of restorative justice. For the survivors, the scars of their experiences cannot be erased by apologies or reforms. The trauma and the loss they endured are a part of their identity, a grim reminder of the inhumanity they were subjected to. The orphan's story forces society to confront its past, to admit to its failings, and to commit to ensuring such atrocities are never repeated. It is a call to action for everyone, from the individual citizen to the highest echelons of power, to uphold the values of compassion, respect, and justice. The legacy of the orphans sold into medical experiments is a complex tapestry of pain, resilience, and reform. It is a poignant reminder of the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, regardless of their circumstances. It is a testament to the capacity of society to learn from its past, to confront its mistakes, and to enact change. It is, above all, a narrative of hope, a beacon of light in the darkest corners of human experience. It is a story that must not be forgotten, a story that continues to resonate and inspire. Thanks for listening. This has been the Dark History Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to support the show, subscribe to the Forbidden Knowledge Network on Patreon. Subscribe now.